and welcome. It's a great pleasure to see quite so many of you here, but not a surprise, given that we're welcoming back an old friend to the school. Paul Halstead, I know, has taught many of us, been a friend to many of us, a colleague for many of us, and it's very nice to see you back. I hope you will all join us after the talk for a reception and a little reunion just over the corridor. From the beginnings of his academic career in Cambridge, Paul moved to the Sheffield department in 1984 and was a key player in an extraordinary renaissance of that department. I think it's fair to say that the MSc courses in environmental archaeology that he and his colleagues established have had a huge impact on European prehistory, not simply Aegean prehistory, as indeed I think many of you can attest. Paul's research interests, of course, focus in later prehistory, in the Neolithic and Bronze Age of Greece, on the relationship between farming economies and social change, and on the contributions of zooarchaeology and ethnoarchaeology to the study of past animal and crop husbandry. His work, while centred in Greece, has taken him very widely around the Mediterranean, Cyprus, Israel, and then north into Bulgaria, and into Britain from time to time. And he's worked on a number of deeply influential projects. Paleambula with Kostas Koutsoukis, a large project on Neolithic animal exploitation in Greece with Valasia Isakidou and her colleagues, including very important work at Knossos. The project with the American School at the Palace of Nestor, which has changed the way we think about animal sacrifice across the Bronze Early Iron Age. And what is to become, I think, a book that probably will, we could say cap a career, but I never say things like that about Paul, that will bring together all these 30, 40 years of experience in ethnography and fieldwork, and that's really what he's going to talk to us about tonight. So I'll give you the floor, and thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. I suspect that the bringing together 30 or 40 years of research is a polite way of saying you took a long time producing it, which would be a fair comment. So, I'll start just by explaining my title. I worked for a number of years on the British School excavation at Asyros near Thessaloniki, and I like to talk to some of the older residents of the village about farming in the old days. And one of the people I spoke to regularly used to ask me several times a week, what does farmer mean? And of course, the first time he asked, I didn't know the answer. And the answer was 2 oxen ahead and 1 behind. Now, to make sense of this joke of his, you have to realise that whereas in English, ox symbolises strength, in Greek, at least certainly in northern Greece, it symbolises stupidity. But he used to contradict himself regularly as well, several times a week. He would also tell me that farming is a complete science, which nobody can master. So, the question I want to ask this evening is, pre-mechanised farmers, were they oxen or scientists? And I think that's scientists in the sort of French sense. And a secondary question, why should the answer to this matter to an archaeologist? So, obviously, the background to this is the point made by Lewis Binford, Ian Hodder, and numerous other archaeological luminaries, that archaeologists, and to that I would add historians, use their knowledge of the present to interpret the past by analogy, by drawing similarities between today and the distant past. And one obvious practical example for those of us who've excavated in Greece would be that familiarity with mud brick walls, standing and collapsing, certainly helps one interpret the foundations and the mud brick rubble that one finds on excavations. But my subject is farming and the role of recent farming in helping us interpret ancient farming. And here the importance of Greece and of the rest of the Mediterranean is that farming without machines and without agrochemicals was going on until fairly recently. And that means that it's been possible for anthropologists, ethnographers, ethnoarchaeologists, of course, some fantastic photographers like Takis Klupas here, to actually record the nature of this farming. It's even been possible for some of us to actually try some of it. And here, that's me trying to winnow, and that's Glynis Jones attempting the same thing. I got various lessons in practical things from the people I've spoken to. I've tried reaping, I've tried winnowing. The thing that really strikes me is that tasks that look simple aren't, or alternatively, I'm just exceptionally inept. But winnowing, I thought, well, I'm fitter and younger than the grandmother who was showing me what to do. I must be able to throw this stuff across the threshing floor faster than she could. But of course, I was undermining what she was trying to do, which was to separate the light straw from the heavy grain. And she very quickly sacked me from my attempts. Now, I'm going to talk about, well, I think it's fair to say that modern research, or analogical research in recent farming, has been used to investigate ancient farming in two slightly different, if overlapping, ways. Now, the first is when we study present crops and livestock as a means of identifying the practices of ancient farmers. So, for example, one project conducted by a team from Sheffield around the village of Tharounia in Evia looked at broad beans that were growing both in small gardens and in big fields. And we found that the weed species, the weed plants, growing in the two types of environment were very different. Likewise, the beans themselves have quite distinctly different nitrogen isotope levels in gardens and in fields. And it's important to note that these distinctions here rest on the behaviour of broad beans, if you like. Now, humans may have decided to garden rather than conduct field agriculture, but what was going on in humans' heads has no impact at all on the relationship between the type of farming regime and the type of weeds or the level of isotope values. So this is very, very safe use of analogy. And on the strength of it, Amy Bogard has managed to argue convincingly that the earliest farming in the Neolithic of Central Europe, particularly Germany, took the form of gardening rather than of field agriculture. This just shows you a statistical analysis which separates fields and gardens simply on the basis of the weed species growing in the two environments. And this is one of the reasons why gardens differ from fields. They have a lot more manure in them. And then the other type of analogical research we could conduct is that where we study present farmers' decisions in the hope of identifying likely, so likely, not definite, reasons for past practices that we know about, or alternatively, for identifying likely past practices on the basis of the circumstances, the known constraints. And I'll illustrate that point. Now, obviously, this kind of exercise is not independent of human decision-making. It's all about trying to explore what decisions humans make and why. So, there's a big risk of circular reasoning here. This is a much more dangerous sort of research. It's the subject of the book, 2 Oxen Ahead, and as in the book, what I'm going to do here is explore some examples of the kinds of complex decisions farmers make. I'll firstly go through the agricultural year, then I'll look at the kinds of decisions they make from one year to the next, and then lastly, the kinds of decisions they make through the domestic cycle. In other words, from the point of where a couple are married and form a separate household, through to the point where their children get married and in turn form separate households. So, the beginning of the agricultural year, in most farmers' perceptions at least, is that of tillage or cultivation and sowing. So, how will they till? How will they cultivate the ground? By hand or by plough? And if it's by plough, will it be pulled by donkeys or cows or oxen? And when I use the word oxen, I mean male cattle. And will they plough just after sowing to cover the seed? Or will they also plough before sowing to kill weeds? Or sometimes, perhaps neither. And then will they sow the crops in autumn or spring? And within each season, will they sow them early or late? Will they sow them thickly or sparsely? And will they sow them by broadcasting or by sowing in rows? So they make a lot of different choices. Now, in deciding how they're going to cultivate and sow, they consider a lot of different factors. So, for example, in choosing between cultivating by hand or by plough, an obvious consideration is how big an area you're going to cultivate. And how urgent is the task? You can obviously cultivate much faster with animals than you can by hand. They will also take account of the heaviness of the soil, so that, for example, some farmers who plough with cows may hire somebody else's oxen to plough their heaviest fields because the cows can't do it. They will obviously have to take account of weather. How wet is the soil? Is it too dry to be ploughed, or is it too wet to be ploughed? And how much labour they've got, both human and animal. And then in choosing when to sow, well, the guiding principle, which you can hear in many parts of Greece, is something, a variation on the theme that the early sown crop is blessed by God, the late sown crop by fortune. In other words, it's a good idea to sow early. And then, how thickly do you sow? Well, in general, farmers sow poor soils thinly because they're not rich enough to support a dense crop. But they may also sow very rich soils thinly to avoid the crop growing too high and then falling over when it rains in spring. And there are also differences between crops. So one expression from the north of Greece to remind you how to sow. Broad bean on broad bean, in other words, closely, and chickpeas here and there, sparsely. And one reason why farmers often sow in rows, although it takes much more labour than broadcasting, is because it makes it easier afterwards to weed or to water the crop. Well, moving along through the agricultural year, we come to harvest. When should you harvest? When the crop is dead ripe or before it's ripe? And do you harvest at midday or in the morning or the evening? Do you harvest high or in the middle or low, like this man here is pulling up whole sesame plants? Do you harvest by hand, uprooting, like the man with the sesame? Or do you use a sickle? And if you use a sickle, do you use a small toothed sickle, the repani, or the bigger untoothed sickle, the leleki? And do you use a finger guard, like this man here, to stop your hands being cut? And each of these different methods of harvesting involves completely different bodily rhythms. So the way in which you work will differ. So, for example, this particular man organises his rhythm by, as he cuts each handful of crop, he sticks it between his fingers. He's got bigger hands than me, so this works. And when he's cut 4 handfuls and filled up his hand, then he'll put them down. He'll have a handful to put on the ground. And that dictates the rhythm with which he works. Other people have different rhythms. And then how big should your sheaves be? Small sheaves like at the top, or very big ones like in the middle. And then, once you've bound your sheaves, do you leave them in the fields to dry like this, as they do in the north of Greece, and of course in much of northern Europe, or do you take them straight to the threshing floor? And then how much labour do you use? Do you just use family labour? Do you use your cousins and more distant kin, perhaps on the basis of you help me today, I help you tomorrow? Or do you hire workers that you pay for? Well, in shaping these decisions, again, there are many different considerations. So, for example, differences between crops. As they say in Crete, barley you harvest as an old man, because when it's ripe, the ear bends over like this. Wheat you harvest as a young man, because it's upright when it's ripe. If you want the straw for fodder, to feed your animals, or to bind sheaves, then you have to cut low. And many of the pulses, like lentils, are harvested by uprooting because they're so short. But because they easily lose their seed, many farmers prefer to harvest lentils and things like that very early in the morning when there is dew, so the ground is soft, and you can pull them up without shaking the plant and spilling all the seed. But on some soils, when you pull the plant up, little stones come up with the roots. So on those kinds of soils, some farmers say that you don't uproot if it's food for human consumption, because that way stones get into the lentils and break your teeth. If it's for the cattle, they've got big teeth, they don't have a problem. They can eat stones as well as things like bitter vetch. And then the way you harvest will also depend on the type of sickle, so that the leleki, favoured by a lot of refugee communities in northern Greece, involves cutting low in a sweeping movement. And the toothed sickle, used by a lot of the local communities, involves sawing like this. Very, very different height and body movements of harvesting. And as for sheaf size, if you're going to transport your crop on a cart, you make small sheaves which are easy to lift. If you're going to do it on a donkey or a mule, you make big sheaves that can be placed one or two on either side of the animal. And again, if there are green, wet weeds in the crop, you firstly have to tie the crop into small sheaves until the weeds have dried. Otherwise, the crop will go mouldy or even catch fire as the wet weeds heat up in the sun. And then the decision whether to make stoops of sheaves in the field depends on whether you harvest when the crop is dead ripe or whether it has to sit in the field for 2 or 3 weeks to dry and ripen completely. And of course your decision about labour will depend on the urgency of the task, which incidentally will differ between Crete, where the crop ripens extremely rapidly, almost overnight, and the north of Greece, where you might have 2 or 3 weeks in which you could decide whether you harvest early or late. Then we move to the threshing floor. Do you thresh by hand, like the lady with the beans, the fasolia, or with animals? And if you do it with animals, do you use a sledge or not? Do you thresh near home or near the field? Do you thresh by day or by night? And in what order do you thresh the crops? These are all choices they have to make. And on the threshing floor, do you use sieves a lot or not? Do you clean the crop thoroughly? And at the end of it, do you wash the grain? And once again, who does it? Just family labour? Do you bring in other kin or even hired workers? Well, once again, lots of things have to be considered. Whether you harvest by hand, whether you thresh by hand or with animals, depends on the volume of the crop. And it also depends on the use of the straw. If you want straw complete to bind sheaves or to make roofs over sheep shelters, then you can't thresh the crop with animals' hooves because they break it up. It depends whether you use a sledge or not, depends on the type of crop. So some things, like the fasolia we saw a minute ago, are rather fragile and are easily destroyed by a threshing sledge. By and large, farmers don't use a threshing sledge when they have a paved threshing floor. I imagine one consequence would be that the flint inserts in the threshing sledge would break on the paved threshing floor, and then you'd get sharp pieces of flint in your food. And it of course depends on the type of animal. People are more likely to use threshing sledges when they're threshing with cattle, which usually will not have shoes on, than with horses or mules, which are usually shod and therefore have, if you like, sharper feet. Whether you thresh near home or near the field depends on the type of crop. So things like lentils and rye, which spill their grain very easily, farmers often thresh very, very near where they're growing so that all the seed doesn't fall out while they're carrying it home. The best time of day, best time to thresh is at midday when it's very hot and it makes the crop fragile. But some people have told me that they used to thresh at night so they could cheat the landlord. And which order do you thresh crops in? Well, obviously it depends on the importance of the crop. Some farmers would make sure that they thresh their wheat first, so it's not possibly but contaminated by any barley grains or other grains which get left on the threshing floor. Whether you use sieves depends on how weedy the crop is, which in turn will depend how well you ploughed the field. And it will depend on the thoroughness of threshing, which will depend, amongst other things, on how hot the weather is, hot and dry. And do you clean the crop thoroughly? Well, people tend to clean it more thoroughly for human food than for animal fodder. Although I did speak to one old lady in Crete whose husband loved his mule so much that she cleaned its oats as much as she cleaned the barley for the family. And then do you wash the grain? Well, some people do. The expression "chiestichi foradas to alloni" kind of alerts you to the problem with threshing with animals, and that is you can't stop them leaving other things in the crop. Now, in reality, the dung which falls on the crop in the midsummer heat quickly dries and then disappears when you winnow. But, you know, if you've seen it being done, you might prefer to eat it without that kind of extra flavour. So some people, at least for the grain which is for home consumption, wash it and then dry it. They never bother when it's for sale. There would be no point. It would be too much for a start, but there would be no point because the other person wouldn't know you'd done it and certainly wouldn't pay you extra. And then as for labour, well, once again, we come down to the volume of crop to be processed and the urgency of the task. And you see storm clouds coming. Now, the farmer's decisions through the agricultural year, I think it would be fair to describe this as forming a chaîne opératoire, in the sense that each stage greatly influences what happens at the next stage. So, for example, if you dig in order to sow, you almost certainly don't have work animals. So you will probably reap high because you won't want straw, in which case you will probably thresh the ears you've collected by hand, and there will be a minimal amount of winnowing to do, as with this lady here with the fasolia, who's just simply going to lift the pods off. There will be no winnowing stage. If you plough to sow, then you've got work animals, in which case you will reap low because you want the straw for fodder, you will thresh ears and straw, and there will be a lengthy process of winnowing and sieving. And the chaîne opératoire, that the links between stages are reinforced by some very strong practical constraints. So, if you ask people often enough, you know, how big an area can you dig in a day, or how big an area can 2 cows plough, you get some surprisingly consistent answers. So somebody digging with a hoe can cultivate between about 0.01, no, let me say it again, 0.01 and 0.03 hectares per day. That's between about 1/10 and 3/10 of a strema per day. And averaged over the year, unless they've got lots of strong, fit teenage boys, then it's going to be difficult to produce enough grain to feed the family. So they produce less, probably, than is needed for the domestic mode of production, DMP, to feed a household. If you plough with 2 cows, female cows, then you can probably plough something like 2 to 3 hectares per year, which would normally be enough to feed a household, and perhaps a bit more. There would be some surplus. And if you plough with 2 oxen, 2 male cattle, then you can cultivate something like 4 to 5 hectares per year. And this is definitely a lot more than you need to feed a family. Now, conveniently, the amount you need of straw to feed these animals is broadly similar to the area they can cultivate. So 2 cows might require, say, 2 to 3 hectares of straw, plus grain when they're working. 2 oxen, in which case you would certainly need at least 1 cow, because oxen, being castrated males, don't reproduce themselves. They would need 3 to 4 hectares of straw, plus grain when they're working. So that the areas that can be cultivated and the areas needed to feed the work animals are fairly similar. And so that means that the amount of land people own and the type of work animals they own tend to be related to each other. And one additional thing is that if you have oxen and you cultivate as much land as oxen can cultivate, then you will almost certainly have too many crops for your own family to be able to harvest them. You will also need to hire outside workers. Well, moving now on to farmers' decisions from year to year. You have to decide if you're going to leave some of your land fallow. Or you have to decide if you are going to rotate your crops, planting perhaps wheat in one field, barley in the field that last year had wheat, and so on. And then you have to make those decisions in space, because not all fields are the same. So the rotation scheme will tend to be different in different fields. And in particular, when you have very small fields, like this hillside in Naxos, you may be making very small-scale decisions. Then you will have to decide where will you spread manure? Which fields, if any, will you weed? Will you water any fields? And you have to decide on your responses to weather, which varies. So if you sow a crop and it fails to sprout because the weather is unfavourable, do you then go and sow it again? If the crop is growing too vigorously, so it will fall over in spring when it rains, do you send the sheep in to graze it down? This is what, amongst others, Theophrastus describes, I think, was it Xenophon? It's described as being particularly characteristic of Thessaly. If a crop is so full of weeds that it will be a nightmare to harvest, do you perhaps just cut it and make it into hay, or send the animals in to graze it? And then finally, if the crop has failed entirely, this is Naxos summer 1990, do you just send the animals in to eat it and not bother to harvest it at all? Well, the sorts of considerations, if you are thinking of leaving a field fallow, you consider how fertile is it? Does it need resting? How weedy is it? Does it need a break to kill the weeds? You'd also have to think about how much land you've got. in order to leave land fallow, you need to have more land than is necessary to feed yourself in a single year. And then you'd have to think, when you start thinking about rotation, you'd start thinking about things like, are some fields shaded by olive trees? That might condition what you plant under them. What about the differences in soil between different fields? You might choose to spread how you sow your land in order to reduce the risk of complete failure, sowing some wheat on a north-facing slope and some on a south-facing slope, and so on. And when deciding which field to spread manure on, you'd obviously have to think about how much manure have you got, how fertile is the field, because it could do harm if it's a fertile field, and also how far away is it, because manure is very, very heavy. In thinking about weeding, you'd think about how much labour you have. Do you have enough hands to go and weed a field? And if you've got perhaps 2 goats in the stall which you're using to provide milk for the family, you might go and weed simply to have fresh vegetation to feed the goats every evening. And in deciding where to use your scarce water on crops, you would think about which crops are more important to you, or perhaps which ones are more valuable as cash crops. And should we re-sow the field that has failed because of a severe winter frost? Well, it would depend on the existing weather. Is that going to make it difficult to go back and re-plough and re-sow the field? And in deciding whether to send my sheep in to graze a field which looks like it's growing too vigorously, I'm trying to guess, will it rain in spring? If it does, I must graze the field. If it doesn't, then grazing the field now will mean I won't get a grain harvest. And then in deciding whether to cut or graze a weedy field, you're considering, well, do I have enough grain without that field? And if I'm going to try and cut it for hay, do I have enough labour to do that at this time of year? And then moving on to the domestic cycle, the changes in decisions over the course of a generation. Perhaps when I realise that I've got 3 sons and that my land holding is going to be divided 3 ways and that each of them will get too little land to raise a family, perhaps we decide to move from growing grain to high return cash crops. That's one reason why currant, stafida, was so popular in the Peloponnese. Or up north, in the north of Greece, we might grow tobacco for the same reason. In the mountains, maize. Things which are labour intensive but very high yielding. Or I might decide to improve the land I've got by putting in drains or by building or repairing terrace walls. Or I might try and extend my land by clearing some woodland. This is an area, in fact, near Palliambela. It's within the territory of Palliambela in northern Greece. And in the 1930s, as an area which had been used as wood pasture and looked like this, so lots of bushes, young trees, was set aside to be cleared by households with insufficient land. And it was issued in units, what they call triaria, because each of them is 1/3 of a hectare, 3,300 square metres. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes, one way of extending your land. Or you might decide to raise a flock. So instead of having, say, a goat on a rope to produce milk for the family, or maybe 3 or 4 lambs to produce meat for the family, you might build up a flock of 100 sheep or 50 sheep that would bring in an income every year, but could also be sold when your children are going to be married off, and you could use the money to buy dowries or to buy land. And once again, we'd have to think about, do we have sufficient labour for these labour-intensive crops like tobacco and currants? How quickly do you need a return on your investment? One farmer was telling me how when he first started planting tobacco, he was planting it in an area where everyone else was planting cherry trees. And they said, you should plant cherry trees. This area is excellent for cherries, and they give you a better price. He said, yes, but I need the money next year, and the cherries won't give me anything for 5 or 10 years. And then there's the prices of the cash crops, and one of the striking things if you collect long-lived family histories in the Peloponnese is how many times over the last 150 years a family may have planted vines and then dug them up as the price crashed, and then they plant them again, and then again they destroy them. Or if you're going to improve your land or extend it, then obviously the amount of labour you've got, or cash to buy labour, is crucial. And in deciding whether you're clearing land for a very short-term cultivation or for long-term cultivation, you'll be not just influenced, you'll be constrained by the quality of the soil. And in deciding whether or not you can build up a sheep flock, then in most parts of Greece that means you need teenage boys. Girls won't do. And of course you also need access to pasture. In some communities the rich members of the village have managed to constrain access to pasture in such a way that this is impossible. So what I'm going to do now, before closing, is just look at some of the implications of these decisions, how they might influence our thinking about farming in the past. And I'm going to take 4 examples, of which the first one is tillage in the past. So we know from work by Vanassia Risakidou in Neolithic Knossos that cattle have very frequent traction pathologies. In other words, it means they have signs of stress, physical stress on their bones, which are thought to be the result of pulling something like a plough. These are quite rare in the European Neolithic, which makes you wonder if there's something about Crete that made draft cattle particularly important. And she's argued, I think plausibly, that the answer may be in the seasonal distribution of rainfall. So these are seasonal rainfall diagrams for different parts of Greece. And as you can see, in the north of Greece, there is rainfall pretty much all the year round, even if the amount varies. But in the south, and especially in Crete, there is a very long and very severe summer drought. What this means is that the harvest starts early, so it is especially important to sow early. But on the other hand, because the drought ends late, farmers are forced to start sowing late. So they're being caught between two pressures. And that means that it's very, very urgent to sow in Crete, and that means that access to animals which can do the job much quicker than people is very important. So maybe that's the reason why we have so much evidence for draft cattle in the Neolithic Knossos. Now that then leads to another question. Was ownership of these cattle universal? Did everybody have them? Looking at the modern figures for how difficult it is to maintain a pair of cattle, I would suspect the answer's probably not. And in that case, ownership of cattle would have been an important force for emerging inequality, economic and social inequality at Neolithic Knossos. This is all as, in fact, argued by Vanassia. Or turning to classical Athens, where the property classification, the Zevgites or Zeugites, I think we used to call them. Is that right, Dave? Ancient historians have argued that they have between 3.6 and 5.4 hectares of land to qualify for this property classification, 36 to 54 square metre. And supposedly, scholars working from textual sources argue that supposedly they cultivated with oxen and left half of the land fallow every year. They had biennial, 2-yearly fallow. But, judging by the information from recent farmers, it seems to me that with this size of land holding, they will either have ploughed with cows rather than oxen, or they will have sown their crops every year rather than every other year on most of their land. And that's simply because of these problems of generating enough fodder to feed your cattle. And it follows further from that, in the light of the recent interviews, that if they were growing annual crops, they were probably growing a larger area of crops than they could harvest with family labour. And this, I think, would reinforce the argument that some ancient historians have made, that they would have been hiring harvest labour very short term, and so presumably not slave labour, which has to be paid for throughout the year, but poorer, free citizen farmers. Another example, it's been argued by first Andrew Sherratt and then subsequently Chet Van Andel and Curtis Runnels, that the distribution of Neolithic settlements in many parts of central and northern Greece in lake and river basins reflects the fact that early farmers were exploiting the flooding of lakes and rivers, so that they were practicing floodwater farming, a bit like the Egyptians do on the Nile. So you wait for the lakes and rivers to flood, they leave a nice layer of fertile mud, and then you scatter grain in the mud, and you have a very good harvest without any effort at all. But the experience of recent farmers who've tried exploiting this particular part of the agricultural landscape is that, firstly, inevitably you have to sow late, spring sowing, which is risky, and in fact, the timing of the floods in most of the great North Greek rivers, the Pinos, the Aniakmon and so on, is sufficiently late that in many years it makes it impossible to sow even New World crops like maize, which are sown much later than European spring cereals. And anyway, it often fails because the flood comes, you plant your seed and you hope for the best, and then next week it floods again and just takes all of the seed away. So this would only work if agriculture was a very minor component of subsistence, which was ultimately based on herding or hunting and gathering, foraging. Another interesting implication is the relationship between food and fodder in the past. When you ask farmers, how much grain does it take to feed a family, many of them will ask, well, how big's the family, which is a reasonable question. But they will usually answer 1,000 kilos, 1,500 kilos, that sort of order of magnitude. When you ask, and how much does it take to feed your animals, even if you tell them how many animals they've got, they will mostly refuse to answer. And if you get an answer, it's usually of the form, you gave them whatever you had. So that the amount of grain you fed your livestock varied. It was flexible. So in a good year, when grain is cheap, so it isn't a terribly good idea to sell surplus grain, you might feed it to your animals to create something more valuable. And just to put that in context, one adult human over the course of a year needs about as much grain as does one working ox or one pig that you want to fatten up for Christmas. In a bad year, when grain is dear and the small-scale farmer is probably buying grain, then he'll sell the livestock to have enough money to buy grain. And this is the reason why Flannery, many, many years ago, argued that livestock perform the role in grain-growing economies of indirect storage. It's a way of storing grain for the future. And they seem to have been doing that from at least the Neolithic, in the sense that we find grain in animal dung on Neolithic sites from Greece, certainly as far as the Swiss lowlands. Now, this flexibility of how you use grain happens both on the threshing floor and afterwards. On the threshing floor, well, you've got a pile of straw there at the top, which is unambiguously fodder. Humans can't really eat it. You've got a a pile of clean grain in the middle, which is food, and then you've got a pile at the bottom, which I've labelled flexible. That is grain which is only partly cleaned. Most of the straw is gone, but there's still quite a lot of straw and weeds in it. And farmers sometimes decide that because there's a storm coming, or it's hot and I'm tired, or because I've got so much grain already I don't need any more, that we'll stop at this point, put it in a bag and feed it to the animals. So they're kind of making decisions about the boundary between food and fodder as they go along. And then also, once it's in store, you make decisions that reflect differences from one year to the next. So, these days, across the Mediterranean, but I'm using Greek examples here, there is a kind of hierarchy of grains. So food, wheat and lentil are fairly unambiguously food. At the bottom, oats and bitter vetch in Greece are unambiguously fodder, they're for animals. You tell them that Scotsmen eat oats and they just don't believe you. In the middle, you've got things like barley, maize, grass pea, that in some parts of Greece are food and some parts are fodder, or in some years are food and some years are fodder. And likewise, what comes out of the mill. White flour is definitely food, it's for the wealthy. Bran is for dogs and pigs and chickens, and wholemeal flour is for poorer human beings. Now, these differences can define differences of status between someone who's well off or poor, human or animal. They can define differences of context, so that farmers that ate, Cretan farmers that ate barley bread all year long would often grow just a small patch of wheat so they could make a white loaf for Christmas and another one for Easter, so that you can offer to the church something white and you don't show yourself up to the neighbours. It's also a safety net for the poor. Sometimes these people who've got this small amount of wheat, if you find that the barley crop has failed and you don't have enough to feed your family, you might take your small amount of wheat and sell it in order to buy, say, 2 or 3 times as much barley. And that might make the difference between the family starving and not starving. And of course, in the case of famine in 1941 in Greece, then what many people did in order to survive is they moved firstly from the top category to the middle category, and eventually they moved down to the bottom category, where people started putting back into their bread all the stuff they'd been taking out in previous years. And we know this hierarchy exists in classical antiquity. The literary sources are quite clear that wheat is civilized, barley is uncivilized, for example. There are hints of it in the Linear B texts from the Mycenaean Late Bronze Age. Earlier than that, I would guess that the hierarchy doesn't exist, simply because we find both things we would think of today as fodder crops and things we would think of as food crops, both stored in the same houses. So on the very limited data we've got, I think the hierarchy isn't there before the later Bronze Age. And maybe one piece of evidence that this is the case is that in the late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, across the Mediterranean, we see how these things, naked wheats, this is bread wheat that you make bread from, this replaces the earlier gloom wheats like emmer, zea, the magic crop that everyone's talking about in Greece today. And at the same time as that happens, this type of barley disappears from Europe and Southwest Asia, and only this type remains, the one with the hulls on. And I think that's the point, probably, where wheat becomes food and barley becomes fodder. And it would have all sorts of interesting implications then for creating social inequality, economic inequality, and so on. And the last of my examples, how am I doing? Is to do with Neolithic clearance and these farmers from northern Greece who were chopping down trees in the 1930s. Now, there are 2 basic models circulating for the nature of early farming in Neolithic Europe. And the model, which goes back to Gordon Childe, and maybe earlier, but Childe is the first place I've encountered it, is that people would engage in slash and burn cultivation. That's where you chop down the trees, burn them, scatter some seed in the ash, and after 1 or 2 years, you move along and destroy some more forest. And recently, that's been supported by some experiments by German archaeology students, that's where these pictures have come from, doing just that, supposedly testing the relative merits of slash and burn and the other form of cultivation, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and deciding that slash and burn gives you bigger yields for less effort. And then the alternative model is that of long-term gardens, and in which study of weeds growing with the grain by Bogard seems to show quite clearly that these people are cultivating very long-term plots. They must have been cultivated for at least 20 years and probably much longer. Now, we have a contradiction. I think what they did is quite clear. They did this, because that's what we have evidence for. But why were they apparently doing something stupid if they could have got more grain for less effort by slashing and burning? And that's where the North Greek evidence is useful. So these North Greek farmers are clearing reasonably fertile soils, not the best, and they tell you that, well, you don't burn the field, because that way you burn off all the leaf litter, which is effectively the manure in the field. That's what makes the field fertile. It's common sense, really. They also point out that the field takes 2 or 3 years to be tamed, that you have to keep digging it and ploughing it for 2 or 3 years before it creates a suitable environment for crops, so that you get your best yields, usually after about 3 years. So they're giving us exactly the opposite account of the German experiments. And I think we should believe the Greek farmers, firstly because you're talking here to farmers rather than archaeology students, which is probably a better way to find out about farming. But also because I think that the German experiment has been structured in such a way that it was bound to give the answer it did, because they've already burnt off all of the fertile leaf litter. So not surprising that the crops get worse thereafter. So, were traditional farmers oxen or scientists? Well, firstly, why does it matter? What I've tried to show here with those final examples is that recent decision-making suggests some implications of ploughing in Neolithic Crete. It suggests that our text-based models of agriculture in classical Greece are probably wrong. It suggests that Neolithic floodwater farming is highly unlikely. It suggests that a hierarchy of grains, which is economically and socially significant, was there in Mycenaean and classical Greece. And it suggests that recent slash and burn experiments are distorting the costs and benefits of early Neolithic woodland clearance. That's just a small sample of the things you could reconsider. So I think, if you can believe what I've said, it's plainly important and valuable. Now, can you believe it? The first point to make is that the suggestions I've made are not certainties, because, obviously, they involve human decision-making. But I want to go beyond just saying, well, they're possibilities, because if they're just possibilities like hundreds of others, they're not terribly useful. They really need to be probable for them to be useful. And farmers' decisions, both recent and ancient, are going to be more constrained, more predictable, if the decisions obey, firstly, practical rather than cultural reason, and cultural reason in the sense as used by Salins, the anthropologist, and that would be espoused, say, by Ian Hodder and his colleagues. And if they practice practical reason, if they obey practical reason, it implies that they're engaging in rational cost-benefit analysis. And again, many anthropologists and archaeologists would argue that cost-benefit analysis is a product of capitalism, and that it would have been beyond the conceptual abilities of ancient people. So I'll just tackle these issues briefly. Firstly, cultural reason, identity. That photograph of the lady in threshing costume, incidentally, was taken in the British School garden. And she and her husband was a concierge just down the road, and came and played bagpipes in the British School garden, which is nice of him. So, one of the great things about northern Greece is we have communities of Thracians, Bondii, and locals, Dopii, living side by side, which makes them a perfect laboratory for exploring cultural influences on farming. Now, these people differ in terms of their music, their food, their dances, their dialects, their dress, and also in terms of their farming tools and farming methods. And even like things like clothing, farming methods evidently, to some extent, mark these people's identities. So when one old man in a Pontic village was explaining to me why they didn't have any sheep and they let the Thracians from the next door village graze their fields, he said, "We Pondii don't speak sheep." You know, it's kind of, it's in our DNA. We can't communicate with them. And of course, you know, these shared beliefs are useful in the sense that shared ways of doing things make it possible for you to work with someone else, and to some extent it enforces working with people from the same cultural group. This is reinforced further by the fact that your motor skills are learned doing farming in childhood, and you usually learn them from your parents, and failing that, your uncle or your aunt. And the other thing to note is that in cases where this traditional way of doing things are disadvantageous, people just seem to abandon it. So in Paliambila, the local Thracians, because their land holdings were too small, decided that for their children to be able to work as paid harvesters for the local communities around them, they should learn to harvest with the local sickle and not the Thracian leleti. So they just decided, that's it, we change. And another example of cultural reason, which is much advocated, goes back to Malinowski's observations on the Trobriand Islanders and the good gardener. Examples of good work that is apparently irrational. So, for example, the man here is his father and his uncle were renowned in Paliambila as being the best harvest workers. They were able to harvest a field so that it looked like it had been cut with a spirit level, an alfadi. They could cut the straws so accurately that the sheaf would then stand up without anything to hold it up. And as he shows us here, the trick of his father, whereby you just rest the sheaf in the curve of the sickle before you bind it, so that the ears are all pointing the same way. And then they don't rub against each other and don't fall out as the thing is being carried off by the donkey back to the threshing floor. Now, is that all just too much effort? Well, I think it isn't really. Firstly, there are practical considerations. If you plough carefully, and these guys were also apparently the best ploughmen in the village, then you kill the weeds, and it makes harvesting quicker, and it makes winnowing quicker, and it raises your yields. It has effects right through the chaîne opératoire. But also, because they were known as good workers, they were the first people that anybody from the villages around wanted to hire. That meant they got paid more when they worked for other people. People apparently, strangers, would walk past the fields they'd harvested and say, "Who did that?" And then they'd be told. And they'd be so impressed, because the ability to cut a field as if with a spirit level was taken as an indicator of other skills and forms of reliability. And likewise, if you're someone who employs people, then the fact that you feed your workers well allows you to recruit the best workmen. And then, as another man told us, it's very important to clean your grain well and mend your sacks, because the miller, who knows everybody from the whole region and will always be the biggest gossip in the region, he will know who has clean grain. So if you've got clean grain, everybody in the district will know, and that means you can always sell your wheat at a good price any time of year, and you can always marry off your children, because people will make the optimistic assumption that they're going to be just like their parents, as we know that's a big mistake. So in other words, there are huge practical benefits of having a reputation as a good workman. And what about cost-benefit analysis? Well, my conclusion from talking to all these people is that, just like academics, farmers are variably clever, from very, very clever to very stupid. They're lazy through to very, very hard-working, and some are lucky and some are unlucky. But they routinely weigh up the costs and benefits of doing things in different ways. And they do this using ancient folk measures, sheaves, days of ploughing, things which are not metric systems imposed by literate state authorities. And they use them to estimate how much labour they need, what their yields will be, whether they'll have a shortfall or a surplus, and so on. And they learn the guidelines for doing this through working as children alongside adults, from the sayings and parables that they hear around the fire at night, because, as they remind you, there was no television, and from close observation of neighbours. Greek villagers, probably villagers everywhere, but certainly villagers in Greece, are incredibly nosy. They all know exactly what the neighbours are doing and watch it with great care. And all of this is perfectly possible in antiquity, and I would say it's actually probable in antiquity, because, to be honest, I don't think farming can work without planning. So, are farmers scientists? Well, the answer you usually get to any question is it depends. And farmers make it quite clear that they're making flexible responses to many, many different variables. And as we've seen, there are local and regional ways of doing things. But many of these are replicated right across the Mediterranean. I've done most work in Greece, but I've done a little bit in Spain, Italy, southern France. And I've been struck on a few occasions when talking to someone, and they tell me something about what they do, and I think, that reminds me of something from Greece. So it leads me to ask another question. And they say, how did you know that? Well, of course, I didn't know it. I was just guessing it because I'd heard it before. But that basically means that given similar circumstances, similar constraints, people make very, very similar decisions, the length and breadth of the Mediterranean. And some of that, of course, is because there are very, very strong constraints, practical constraints of weather and labour availability. The decisions they make are not determined, so they're not securely predictable. But I would argue that they yield probable answers. So it's worth making them and then trying to explore whether you can find supporting evidence. And the last point I just make is that these farmers' decisions are so constrained by practical constraints, weather, labour, cash, prices, that I suspect that much of the work by historians and archaeologists, which emphasises the role of technology and know-how in social and economic change over time, is probably grossly overestimating their role. I think really probably what changes over time are the conditions of existence of these farmers, rather than how much they understand about the practicalities of farming. Thank you very much.